it's a really horrible evening out there. So congratulations on having even made it here. I'm sure if I'd been at home, despite the fact I'm chairing, I'd probably have done it online. I'd love to welcome you to this Anglo-German Foundation lecture. Let me tell you a little bit about the lecture series. The series was endowed to commemorate the work of the Anglo-German Foundation for the Study of Modern Industrial Society, which ran from 1973 to 2009. We're very fortunate to have Brian and Simon here from the Anglo-German Foundation as well. The first lecture was delivered in 2011 under the auspices of the British Academy by Sir Tony Atkinson, and it was on the subject of Britain, Germany, and social Europe, 1973 to 2020. Over the past few years, this series of lectures has been managed by NISA, and what we do is we alternate between having a German speaker in London and an English speaker in Berlin. So next year, we'll all be over in Berlin. Last year, we had Wendy Carlin actually speaking in Berlin at the British Embassy. Today's lecture is on inflation and public debt. Now, both the UK and Germany face unprecedented economic and fiscal challenges, among which slow growth, an aging population, high budget deficits, rising debt, and all that in an environment of international economic and political instability. Former strengths appear to have become weaknesses, and both countries are looking for paths out of stagnation. With high debt, central banks are facing implicit and, in some cases, the US, explicit pressures to accommodate fiscal policy. This talk will discuss differences and similarities in the fiscal and monetary policy challenges facing the UK and Germany, in particular regarding price stability. The lecture is going to be delivered by Professor Michael Krause, who's a professor of macroeconomics at the Faculty of Management, Economics and Social Sciences at the University of Cologne and director of the Institute for Economic Policy. Prior to that, he was assistant professor at the University of Tilburg and a senior research economist at the German Bundesbank in Frankfurt. And it was in that context where I first met Michael, because we were both working as part of the European System of Central Banks Wage Dynamics Network in the good old days when the United Kingdom was actually part of Europe. Michael's work focuses on monetary and fiscal policy and the macroeconomics of the labour market, hence the shared interest in the Wage Dynamics Network. Today, we're going to concentrate on the macro, monetary and fiscal policy side of his research. Michael, it's over to you. Thank you.
First, check whether the microphone, does it help? Does it work? Maybe I put it on my tie and I put it. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Stephen, for the introduction. Is it audible or shall I bring it closer to me? Okay, better. Okay, great. Thanks so much. Yeah, so I'm really, really delighted to be here because I think I have a reason to feel connected to England. My first vacation outside of Germany was with my parents to somewhere in the south of England, on Isle of Wight, right? We were somewhere there. Then language holidays, all the things that Germans did in the 70s to learn proper English. And then later, my parents even moved to England. They lived in Surrey, so I had 9 years of back and forth while I was after high school, starting to work and then later studied. So I really like to be here because, yeah, England, I mean, for some Germans, England feels like their second home because there are similarities that and things that we admire. And so, yeah, that's all I want to say for my the emotional part. Maybe one or two other things pop up. The topic today, I mean, when Stephen asked me to give a talk, I was wondering what can I say, and then realized that the topic I'm interested in is actually the topic that you may be also interested in, which is the internal connection between public debt and inflation. And then I thought it would be interesting to compare the UK and Germany. And the more I compared, the more similarities I discovered in even in some details. So I tried to give a talk where I first kind of make a comparison between Germany and the UK just on 4 variables, because otherwise we get it gets too complex and too multidimensional. So GDP growth, inflation, the budget deficits, and public debt as kind of the guiding variables. And then I want to highlight some aspects of the situation in Germany and the UK that are probably similar. Then, so I felt not too encouraged to give a research talk, like with equations and derivations, and in the end something not so exciting pops up, but I still want to do a little bit of accounting to condense the relevant and important things into one equation. Maybe that's useful. Then also, I have worked a while ago on the topic of inflation and public debt, but also currently I'm working with a co-author from the Bundesbank in Frankfurt on an extension of the fiscal theory of the price level that may help us understand certain aspects and also certain risks better that we face when tackling public debt. And if we arrive there, if time allows, I will give some impressions about the current reform efforts in Germany. We all went into the year very optimistic that the new government would finally do the reforms that must be in everybody's interest. And the last weeks have shown that they go piecemeal and very tactical and make compromises between areas that shouldn't be subject to compromises. So for some observers, it's very disappointing what the government is doing. And the German Council of Economic Experts and other economists are really trying to do everything to influence the decision-making process, because what the government especially has planned regarding pensions looks disastrous or the step in the wrong direction. So it's, I will say a little more about that. And then, I mean, there's this, again, a lot of degrees of freedom and a lot of things to look at, but one thing I came across is what characterizes Germany and the UK in the global economy. What are our specialties? What are we strong at? And I found in one other publication of one of the research institutes in Germany, a nice analysis of the revealed comparative advantage in different types of sectors. And I think that will be also interesting, because maybe that helps both countries to identify where they should put their energies into and where their strengths may be. So let me first show you kind of the graph that shows the 4 variables that I mentioned. And if you look at the top 2 graphs, you may not be able to identify which one is Germany, which one is the United Kingdom. And because inflation and GDP growth seem to have developed the same way, somewhere between 0 and 5% most of the time. There were business cycle fluctuations in GDP growth. There were fluctuations, of course, in inflation, but not so different. However, you see a lot of inflation in the 80s, which I cannot recall was very high in Germany. So that may have been Britain. And then when you look at the bottom 2 panels, you see the structural balance, the balance of the government finances relative to potential GDP. And there you see very different movements. And especially during the crisis, you see a big deficit mounting in the 2020s, when Corona started. And then public debt, I think, finally reveals or makes obvious which countries, which is which. The red line is Germany, so very close to this dashed line, which is the 60% target or goal for public debt relative to GDP that the EU recommends. It doesn't enforce anything, but it recommends. So Germany has never been so far away from it, also in the run-up to the euro. And the UK actually has been living with much lower debt, as we see on the right, below 50% of GDP. And only since the financial crisis, debt has mounted up. I mean, it's kind of surprising. I didn't expect such a regime shift in the public finances of the UK. And then after that run-up in the 2010s or teens, I don't know, what the parlance is for the 20 teens, debt stayed high, and then the next shock came, right? The Corona shock, and debt jumped up as well. I don't know whether it was partly because GDP shrank, but since it's persistent, it must have been increased spending, and we see that on the left-hand side. And I think the picture on the right bottom shows already the challenges, right? For the UK, debt is high, and high debt means high interest payments to finance the debt, and that makes the country also vulnerable to interest rate variations. And in Germany, things seem to look good. I mean, we have done well in reducing the debt since 2010, but then, and also in the Corona crisis, debt only went up a little bit, which is kind of surprising, but has to do with the export market. China did well, so we didn't need to do a lot of stabilizing measures. But now you see at some point forecasts start in 2024, 25, and from that on, you see this upward tick here, and that's the result of the current spending packages that the government has decided on. And I think tomorrow they will make further decisions to hand out or to adjust pensions more in the upward direction rather than keeping them stable. They never talked about cutting pensions, but it's all a question about the growth rate. And this is already accounted for here, and that's probably also a moderate or conservative estimate. So we are heading to a higher debt. You may still say it's low, but we always have to keep in mind the debt of the Eurozone is relevant for Germany as well. The pressure on the central bank to let inflation happen, to adjust interest rates, doesn't come only from Germany or not, but it comes from the southern European countries and the representatives maybe of these countries and the governing council of the ECB. So we are behind the good German conditions lies also the perspective of the European Union, which we have to take into account. So I will come back to these different variables later on. So we basically have a similar performance in GDP growth and inflation in Germany and the UK. We have maybe a weaker structural balance in the UK. The debt per relative to GDP potential is higher. The deficit is higher, and the debt now is much higher. But as I said, Germany is on an upward trend. It has removed the so-called, or loosened the debt brake, which was introduced in 2009 to show markets that Germany is not going to run up big amounts of debt after the financial crisis, but has instituted a constitutional mechanism to bring debt always back to acceptable levels. But in March, just before the new government came into force, the old majority of the parliament, so the new parliament was voted but not yet constituted. So the old majority of the parliament decided on changing the constitution to allow for spending for what they call it's untranslatable, but for a fund from which they can finance defense and infrastructure investment or main investment. So that was just done before the new parliament came into power, where these parties wouldn't have had the majority to change the constitution. So there was a lot of some people regard it as very unpleasant tactical moves that were done. But given that it gave Germany a lot of leeway also to finance defense, I think I would say many people thought it was worthwhile rather than being paralyzed after in the new government. So, but our fiscal outlook, I think, is likely to worsen. I mean, we see in the numbers the explicit problems of the finances, but then we know demography is changing. Pension systems have to cope with, sounds maybe too negative, but have to balance out the recipients of pensions and those who finance the pensions. Elderly care will become more expensive as we age. I also noticed that I'm not excluded from that. It may come one day. Healthcare, as a particular aspect of that. It also becomes more expensive the older you get. Then, of course, defense, as I mentioned. Then we face a changing global competitive environment. The products or the strengths that we had, I think both countries had, are dwarfed by the fast development of, especially of China, and maybe also of other regions. I mean, China's very strategic, very focused, very smart also in what it develops and how it develops. Then we have also the political will and ambition to react to climate change, which creates costs. And I guess there are many things that I haven't even thought of, but there's a lot that is in the background. So I have a list of economic fundamentals and observations which where I mainly focus on Germany, and I hope there's something new or something which where for you it's obvious where the difference lie to the UK. And one thing to notice, which kind of only in the last 2 years the Germans became aware of, that our growth is terribly low since 2019. We are basically stagnating. There's no increase in GDP since just with Corona. We have a growing population because of immigration. It's step by step increasing. So more people have to share a constant pie or a shrinking pie, and that, of course, creates distributional conflicts. Then our manufacturing production is well, there's always a dramatic word for everything, but it's declining, it's falling, and the car industry is a prominent example for that. With that, potential output growth is falling, so we have low capital accumulation, low productivity growth, and the labor force is beginning to shrink soon because of the retirements due to people reaching the pension age. And connected to that, the expenditures for the pension system are on an increasing path if we don't do anything. And let's see, that's a current discussion in the German parliament. And then we also have this backlog of infrastructure investments. We were just talking before about the kind of the peace dividend that many countries enjoy. But for Germany, it meant, saving on defense, but we also seem to have saved on a lot of other things. And we, as we say in economics, sometimes we ate the capital stock. So not enough was invested in maintaining the infrastructure, especially the German train system. I think is now proverbially unpunctual. I think we have really fought hard to push other regions from the pedestal, and really there's not a day where not something weird and unexpected happens. And now that we try to improve the infrastructure, we have even to stop whole train tracks and lines, and there are weeks of paralysis. So it was not very forward-looking. Okay, defense I mentioned, and we also have a problem with the skills of the labor force shrinking, also because highly skilled workers retire that have these specialty knowledge and specialty product skills to produce. I mean, we have companies that produce machines that produce something that only that other company produces. There are these niche companies who really have an extremely skilled workforce, but these slowly begin to retire, and not enough people are going following their lead. So these are problems probably that resonate, except for the Bahn. I think the train system in the UK works much better than this. But you have, at least I arrived yesterday in time. The train was there. But I guess the other things are just sound very, very similar. And then, of course, we have to ask, is there a strategy that we could both follow, both countries could follow? So I'm drawing here on a lot of diagrams and information that the German Council of Economic Experts, which is like a group of 5 economists, has produced 2 or 3 weeks ago, and which always kind of gives a diagnosis of how the German economy is doing. And there's also a second object called the Gemeinschaftsdiagnose, which is a joint projection of the 5 leading research institutes, maybe similar to your institute here. So looking at industrial production, I mean, the left panel shows us Germany in comparison to the rest of the world and to the Euro area. And you see the rest of the world is moving ahead. Industrial production is increasing and is on an unbroken trend. The Euro area itself, the blue line is, yeah, I don't know whether that is a positive trend, but at least it is recovering after 2020. But you see the dark blue line, Germany, after the Corona recession, and even from before, production has been falling and is now 10, maybe almost 20% lower than it was in 2018 or so. So it's not just cyclical. That cannot be just cyclical. This is structural. And on the right-hand side, you see which sectors are suffering from that. And I mean, the first thing I always look at is motor vehicles, because how's the car industry doing? And that's the greenish lines, the third color from the top and any of these bars on the right. So that has been decreasing by about 2 percentage points since the beginning of the 2023. Then you see heavy metal industry, electrical industry, machinery and equipment. These machines that are the specialty, create machines that are unique to even the world economy. Pharmaceutical products are shrinking, and then of course others as well. But you see this general trend that manufacturing is not the powerhouse of the German economy anymore. I think that was until 2018 or so the kind of the safe ticket that we had in the global economy. And the reasons are, of course, tariffs not yet, cannot be really tariffs. It must be the competition from China, from other countries, various domestic factors, but I mean, the trend is clear. Now, manufacturing itself, to have one more look at how production developed since 2021, since after Corona. And what's striking here is also kind of the sideway movement. Manufacturing sector as such also here, 10% lower than in the beginning. But here you also see the energy intensive sectors, which are suffering from the very high energy prices. Right? We have reduced our energy supply in Germany for environmental reasons. First, it was atomic power. Then we also that we took off the grid. Then coal energy production is tried to be reduced, and the substitutes were not there yet, and therefore we have extremely high energy prices, and companies are struggling to keep their production profitable, especially the energy intensive sectors. The steel industry is in deep trouble, and that this on my screen, yours looks also purple, shows clearly in the data. The last thing I found interesting also is manufacturing. Since 2023, the capacity, the utilization of the manufacturing sector is extremely low. So there's both a demand problem, apart from these structural problems affecting potential output, which over the years, I mean, I show you later how potential output shrinks. So we are in a double crisis, if you will, both in a cyclical and in a structural decline in manufacturing. I guess the capacities will follow if the utilization stays so low for so long. What else do I have? Here, potential output growth, and that I find really interesting because this is kind of also economics 101. Think of a production function. Inputs are knowledge or technology, workers, and capital. And up to 2016, you saw high output, potential output growth. So estimated also using production functions, and then you estimate the contributions of the different inputs, and you see basically relatively high productivity growth. Capital stock is increasing, which it has to. It follows usually productivity growth, and then the labor volume also was increasing a little bit in 2015 when we had the first big increase in migration. But you see how the labor force already starts to shrink in 2021. Then we had these confusions about the after Corona, there was a little bit of an uptick, but now you see from 2025 onward how Total factor productivity growth is projected to be very low. Capital accumulation, capital growth as well. The two move together, and in a simple growth model, solo model, you would get that also theoretically. And the labor volume is having a negative contribution on output growth. So our output potential is shrinking, mainly due to the labor force that retires. And a little more detail you see on the right-hand side as a last part about the labor volume. What aspects are these? So you see the green and light green, that is, there's a structural unemployment rate which fell over time. So that was a positive contribution to labor force growth. The participation rate was increasing. The labor force participation of women went up over time, but somehow everything seemed to have reached a limit. And since 2020, we have labor force growth. That's partly immigration. That's people going back into the labor force after Corona. But the projection is very, very negative, right? Even when you see the labor force, how it shrinks by about 0.5% per year, and the migration that takes place, the yellow line, maybe makes up for a quarter of that, at best a third. So migration that can also replace the workers that are retiring is making a contribution, but it's probably quite low. And this is where the demographic, some people call it time bomb, is now materializing. I mean, when I studied in Bonn in the late 80s, the teachers there were saying we are running into a demographic problem in 20, 30 years. And every 5 years there were big discussions, but somehow we haven't found a solution to it. And yeah, that is really going to hit the German economy because so many more workers are going to retire, and most of them choose to retire, even though they could work longer. Let me just check. Okay, yes, monetary policy is coming. So inflation, you also see, I mean, inflation on the left-hand side, you see the consumer price index, we get close to 2%. So from the ECB's perspective or Bundesbank's perspective, there's nothing much to worry about. On the right-hand side, what I find remarkable, so this is GDP deflator, so only the production of domestic goods, and it can be split up into also labor productivity changes, worker payments to employees, and profits. You see a little bit of greedflation, if you would call that. I don't know whether you had this greedflation discussion in the UK as well. My theory was firms were just anticipating that their costs are going to rise, and when they increase prices, they do it now, knowing that their margins will shrink again. And in my kind of eyeball econometrics, I would say, yeah, this is now happening actually since 2024. The blue line is in the negative territory, so profits are shrinking again. Then maybe the echo of the increase if we believe in price stickiness and long-term contracts. But workers, the inflation, the compensation for employees has a big contribution to inflation, and it must be, yeah, the attempt to catch up with the price level that had risen in the past. I mean, inflation alone. I mean, there was a politician saying, yeah, we are fine now. The inflation is back to normal, so people can afford again what they could afford. No, we are at a much higher level, and now workers, of course, are fighting to make up for the real wage loss that they had during the period of high inflation. So there's a little bit, I think that's maybe also a factor that makes it discussion of the situation in the US so politically fragile. Recently was this term, or the term they're using is the affordability crisis. No, even if inflation is doing fine, if the economy is, unemployment is low, the economy is growing, if you still cannot afford what you need, what you were used to at least, and of course what you need, then that has also political implications, and that may also make life a little harder for the current president. In monetary terms, inflation looks okay, and I would almost bet it might look similar in the UK. Now, policy, what is happening at the moment is that all of three major central banks, the Bank of England, United States, and for the Euro area, are all lowering the interest rates. The ECB hadn't increased them as much, and so they start from only from 4%, but everywhere the trend is downward. So you would think this is good. This is good for governments. Life gets cheaper. They can borrow again. They wouldn't have to put a lot of of the budget into servicing the debt. But that doesn't look as nicely when you look at long-term bonds. So since 2020, in all areas, the yields on long-term government bonds have increased. Well, I mean, since 2020, of course, by a lot, but they're also at quite high levels. So even though the short-term rates are falling, the long-term rates are rising, which you could say, okay, this is a normalization. So is that maybe they just went up because the short-term rates went down, and the long-term yields just get back to a normal level. I don't know whether you have heard of Robin Brooks. He has this blog called Shadow Price Macro, and he keeps arguing already for a while that what happens in the long end is really scary. And this shows for a subset of the countries he looks at. The 2-year rates, these are the black lines. The blue lines are the 10-year rates, which we just saw. And then you have the differential between the 10-year rate expected in 10 years and the 10-year rate expected in 20 years. And there you see a lot of upward movement at the long end. I mean, the UK has very high long rates according to that measure. The red line on the bottom left is quite high, it's much higher than the black line. So there's no co-movement between these two types of rates. Germany as well, going up here, December 2025. We're there. So that went up, and Japan even has interest rates at the very long end that are very high, and that is, of course, a problem for governments that want to finance long-running debt. So the long-term yields have risen further at the far end of the yield curve. Only Switzerland, that's not shown here because it would have been too much, but they are basically traveling at almost zero. There's nothing. That is maybe the last safe haven in the global economy. And in the past, I mean, Robin, he argues that in the past it was also Germany. It was one of the safe havens, but not anymore. Now I remember 10 years ago, the maturity of government bonds in the UK was particularly high. It was the country with one of the developed countries with the highest duration of their debt. If you see long rates being high, you may want to go into issuing more short-term debt because it looks cheaper, but also makes you more susceptible to repricing, because if you have to refinance every 2 years rather than every 5 years, you react stronger to interest rates, or your costs respond stronger. On the other hand, markets may be getting suspicious. If you shorten the maturity of your debt, are you going to, I mean, what does it say about your intention to keep inflation low or not? So on the one, if you want to issue long-term debt, then that's susceptible to high inflation. And I don't know how the game ends, but I think there will be changes in the debt structure in many countries. So I want to kind of put these things together in a little bit of theory. I couldn't resist. And for that, that helps to discuss how to reduce debt. And I think in the end, I will draw on your proposals for the government about what to do about the budget. And I think it goes exactly in the direction that we can see here in this in the equation that I've developed. So just a little bit of accounting. So I first want to focus on the budget constraint to see what the policy options are, what we can actually do about public debt. And then I want to talk a little bit about the interaction, fiscal and monetary interaction, because it's kind of work in progress, but we found some interesting effects in our theoretical development that Matthias Hoffmann and I did. So I think it's quite interesting because it shows the importance of credibility and commitment to keep debt under control. Actually, how am I with time? Am I already talking 45 minutes, roughly? So, okay, I will. Sorry, surfaces. So not too bad. Okay, but I will. I think it's a good. Actually, where I hope to be. And now, so I mean, what is the budget? It's the debt you issue and the taxes you raise. That's the money you get in. The government gets into its pocket, and it spends it on what it's there for to spend and on servicing the debt. In a simple model with short-term debt, this would be the debt all the debt would become due in a given period, and then you have to pay the interest agreed on when the debt was issued. Of course, we could have long-term debt here that has a long maturity, and then only a fraction becomes due, and the other fraction is held until maturity. So the variables, I think it's quite obvious. You have, or self-explanatory. You have the debt B. Okay, why it's B? Bond issued, right? So it's nominal debt shown here, then taxes that have to be paid, raised, and government spending, and the nominal rate is agreed on or is implicit when the debt is issued and it's to be paid. Then the par value has to be paid back. And then it's more interesting to compare the nominal debt. I mean, that would be some trillions of pound. Compare that to nominal output. So divide everything with what I call here P times Y, price level times output. And you get a very compact equation that shows you how the real value of debt evolves. That's this little BT. So the ratio of debt relative to GDP. I mean, if they're both nominal divided by each other, the whole thing is also real, the real ratio. And what are the two factors that drive the evolution of debt in period T? It's on the right-hand side, the surplus of the government. The higher the surplus is, taxes minus spending, the lower the debt will be, because you can pay back some of the debt. And then you have to ask what happens to your old debt. And of course, you pay the interest, IT minus 1, the nominal interest on that. You compare that with the inflation rate that has taken place between the periods. So that gives you the real rate, how much you pay back in real terms. And because output is growing over time, the growth rate of output also, in a sense, devalues your old debt, because the volume of debt relative to your spending capacity shrinks. That's the simple logic here. So the higher gamma is, the growth rate of the economy, the better is your chance that debt is actually going down. And that's, in a nutshell, why people argue we have to generate growth, cope also with our debt problems. We have generated growth to cope with our pension problems, because if growth is high, then it is much easier to pay back. So here are just some definitions, but I think the inflation rate pi and the growth rate of output is obvious. So here a little bit compactor. Now I put the real interest rate instead of nominal divided by inflation. And you can already see that if the real interest rate is, if you want it to be stable, so even if the surplus is, so if you want debt to be stable, you just need to raise enough surplus to pay the debt service on the outstanding debt, and then the rest is just rolled over, and just you have to account for the real growth of the economy. And now it comes into the question: what can the government do? It's not much. It's very simple. So either the revenue has to increase, you have to raise more taxes, or reduce spending. That will help bring debt down to a pass. I think this is all very simple. You may want to generate higher growth. If there's a growth surprise, that would be good too, because the real interest rate wouldn't have incorporated that. The price setting of the interest rate would not have accounted for growth. Or you want to generate inflation. So one strategy that is often mentioned is, can we just inflate away the debt? I mean, it looks, from a bookkeeping perspective, it looks easy, but economically it's really hard. I mean, and I will try to make that clearer, or I think it's maybe almost obvious. I mean, the moment you start, you have to raise inflation really fast to devalue the outstanding debt that has not been priced under the expectation of high inflation. I mean, the moment you reprice your debt, it will agents will anticipate that the government is going to keep raising inflation. So you have to be really fast. So in a model where all the debt matures after one period, then of course you have to generate all your inflation in the first period. Maybe you can cheat the public and claim that it was an accident or there were external circumstances that you couldn't control. And maybe the public says, okay, I will keep expecting low inflation. Inflation will stay, expectation will stay anchored. And if they stay anchored, also the pricing of debt will be at low interest rates rather than high interest rates. But you cannot play this game very long. I mean, that's not in a model with short-term debt, but with a colleague at the Bundesbank 10 years ago, we developed a model where we had long-term debt. We had agents forming beliefs about the credibility of the central bank and indirectly by the government of whether it would let inflation increase or not, whether it would stick to its target or implicitly raise its target in order to inflate the debt. And even with this possibility of tricking the public or exploiting their faith in your commitment to keep inflation low, you cannot reduce debt by a lot. I mean, you can maybe, if you increase inflation for a long time by a lot, say to 8% for many years, then you can maybe reduce your debt by 10, 20% or so. But I think 8% inflation and communicating that would not be very popular. And for more modest rises in inflation, you cannot really achieve much of a reduction in debt, maybe 10% or so, in the real value of debt. I mean, maybe that may be useful if you are at a critical threshold, but it's really hard because the repricing of debt sets in immediately. And if you think of risk premia going up as well, because if the government gives up the target once, it may give up the target again. In the end, you pay. I mean, the last thing is, again, growth. If it happens that the real interest rate is smaller than the growth rate, then debt finances itself, right? Then the factor here in the equation, the factor in front of the past debt, BT minus 1, would be smaller than 1. So even if you don't do anything, debt would shrink because you grow yourself out of debt. But that's usually it's an accident rather than policy. I think it's hard to engineer high growth for one thing, and it's hard to keep interest rate below that growth. Maybe if the world interest rate is low and your country is growing fast, then you can benefit from this effect. Or financial repression, which is often argued was the case after the Second World War. Capital markets were not open. People couldn't just save wherever the returns were highest, so they were stuck with their savings account. And I think Nixon, or even before that, there were regulations about keeping interest rates low. I think that wouldn't work well nowadays. Although Japan is an example that somehow Japan manages to keep almost all its debt within the country. Its debt is held in Japan. Savers have to usually buy Japanese debt, and there's not a lot of. It's very expensive to borrow money or to invest abroad in Japan. So maybe they found a clever way. To summarize, what are kind of the risks of the sustainability of public debt? So, of course, the interest rates you have to pay can change with market sentiment. Many of us maybe know the Calvo model of runs on public debt, which can be one of many equilibria. Then expectations as such may increase the interest rates you have to pay. And central bank monetary policy strategy may change. And this is kind of a very benign term, but if Donald Trump manages to get someone into normally the Fed governors were in the end people who followed a strict policy. I mean, even Powell was a nominee by Donald Trump and did, I think, a monetary policy that was in the spirit of central bank independence. But we see the media pressure that is exerted at the Fed, and I would call that a more changing monetary policy strategy, although they wouldn't admit that this is a goal. And we have to wait and see whether, in the end, people change their head once they're in the central bank. That would be the hope. Um, I mean, one thing once you ask yourself, then it's obvious, but the 70s were really an easy time when it came to debt, right? I think on average, debt was below 40% or even less, 20% in some countries of GDP. Now we have 120%. So whatever the interest rate does not really affect your budget very strongly. It doesn't eat up as much of your budget. I once read or actually heard on a tape the biography of Maggie Thatcher, the Downing Street years, and she describes in one chapter the meticulous discussions they went through to cut spending, because typically the Bank of England would just fill the deficit by printing money that would basically make a remittance to the government for whatever was not covered. And having read Milton Friedman, she didn't want the money supply to keep increasing through that channel. So, I mean, the effort was immense, but from far away, it looks like, compared to today's debt problems, it looks easier. But of course, there was a lot of spending pressure, and inflation was kept increasing. So now, I mean, in the 2010s, we had the opposite problem. We had high debt, but interest rates were very low. So people, I guess, also didn't worry about interest rates. And you may know I don't know what branch of what it is, but modern monetary theory, which argues that we can basically increase debt and as much as we like, as long as we have needs that need to be financed. And when you have discussions, then the argument goes, yeah, look at Japan. They had zero debt and zero interest rates and have debt of 230 or so % of GDP. That worked. Why shouldn't it work for us? I think it has become a little more silent about this modern monetary theory, or so-called, yeah, I don't want to get started, but I wrote a few papers on that. 5 minutes? Okay, then let me. So in any case, so these negligible effects of interest rate increases, they are not there anymore. We are now in a high interest rate regime, and I think we immediately see that we cannot just increase debt without problems. So actually now I have to hurry. I was confused by the time slot that I had, but I would try to be there. So, okay, with Stéphane Moyen from the Bundesbank 10 years ago, we developed this model. I think I still like it. It has like a lot maturity structure of debt, but you cannot surprise people enough to reduce public debt. The last thing I want to quickly show you, if you extend the model about debt also with the model about monetary policy, interest rate setting that depends on inflation, and inflation that depends on activity and expected inflation, you can of course see immediately, okay, if the central bank wants to reduce debt, it has to create a boom. It has to, of course, do something with the interest rates that may affect your debt evolution. But you also see that once debt is high, the decisions of the central bank with respect to the interest rate have a strong effect on the budget, right? And I think this is what many governments are worried about now, that if the central banks just raise interest rates when economic conditions prescribe it, they may make it harder for the government to balance its books, and in the worst case, just induce them to raise more debt and make the problem more difficult in the future. And we all know that the American debt is accelerating. The increase in debt is even going up nowadays. One thing which I want to bring across, because I think it is really interesting, we have a model, Matthias Hoffmann and I, we have developed a model where we have asked, okay, there can be two regimes, one where central banks control inflation and the other where the fiscal authority controls debt. What if the fiscal authority, and the other regime is one where the fiscal authority basically doesn't care, it doesn't raise interest rates, tax rates enough. And then if the central bank is basically forced to become passive, and that we call a fiscal dominance regime. And often in economics, these two things are compared. You have either or. There are now some newer models where these things can also switch, or these logics can exist in parallel. What we asked is, what if there's imperfect information about the intent, about how strongly the central bank, the government is going to reduce debt, and the possibility of switching into this other regime where basically the central bank gives up and lets inflation get out of control. And so the only thing you should look at is the black line peeking out of these other lines. The black line tells us that if agents are unsure what the future stabilization policy of the government will be, you get both, you have to raise a higher surplus to bring down your debt. So your debt jumps up, and it jumps up by more than if agents are fully trusting the government to reduce the debt. You have to run a higher fiscal surplus to bring your debt back because it has jumped up more. And the worst thing is inflation even jumps up, increases by more than it otherwise would. So in this experiment, government increases its spending once. That's why you see this short deficit, and then in the middle, it generates a surplus to pay back. So if there is doubt about the willingness of the government to really be on a sustainable trajectory for debt, you get higher debt, you get higher primary surplus that you have to generate to pay back the debt, and inflation goes up by more. I think that's really interesting. I mean, we have to kind of go into the machine room to see what's going on there, but I think it's a reminder also how important it is to be to stick to a credible rule and not gamble with your credibility. So looking at, I think this is your institute's proposal. So the chancellor should aim to build a buffer on at least 30 billion. And I think to build a buffer is, I cannot get the numbers, but I'm sure you're right. But you need a buffer. I mean, who knows what is coming in the next few years. You have to insure against shocks. The shocks will have a bigger effect on the budget if it's connected to the interest rate. And the second point is exactly the point, right? You have to set a clear declining path, and you have to promise that path. And I think you buy by being on a credible path, you buy yourself also less inflation and less debt in the end. I would argue from the results that I just showed you. Growth is probably not going to reduce your public debt. I mean, your growth forecast is down, and I think the same in Germany. We also slower. The forecasts are revised downward, and inflation is expected to fall. I mean, that's great to reach a target, and that's of course the mandate of the Bank of England. And then, yeah, okay, this is predictions, I guess, you get from your forecasting models, whether the interest rate goes down. So let me wrap up because 10 minutes ago, you said it's still 5 minutes. So just one thing, what can we do in the international economy? And I have, one can see this graph, I only show that the market shares of many countries, including Germany and the UK, the Vereinigte Königreich, are shrinking. And of course, because other countries are growing, like China. And what I found really interesting, I don't know whether you knew this, I didn't know this concept of revealed comparative advantage, which shows where, by the actual activities of a country, where the comparative advantages lie. And there we can look at Germany producing the manufacturing sector, the dashed line. Germany seems to have a comparative advantage. UK doesn't look so good. In the car industry, actually, Germany has a big comparative advantage, but it's actually shrinking. You see that at the very end. I mean, England was always in car manufacturing, but not prominent anymore. Then you have chemical industry. Actually, there also the UK had a very relatively high comparative advantage. So whenever you are above 1, you have a comparative advantage. So this is a procedure that goes back to Balassa. That's what they used here. And I think textile industry is not something we would focus on. And what surprised me, so we have steel industry. Okay, Germany goes up and down. The UK also doesn't have a comparative advantage there. And information technology, I think we are all not in good shape. I think that must be the US it should be the US having a big comparative advantage, but actually here it turns out communication technology is China. Okay, our iPhone technology is the network in mobile network. I think in Germany is Huawei. So maybe that's why. So I wanted to find something exciting or interesting about where can we focus on, and then tell you that Germany and the UK should focus on these sectors, but it's not obvious. And maybe that a similar analysis should be possible for more sectors, and having a deeper look at how well the UK is. So let me close. So I think UK faces the rising challenges of the public finances, and inflation solutions, I think, are not feasible. Inflation may happen because of high debt, but it's not a strategy to reduce high debt. Just because I think the main factor is the repricing of interest rates that takes place very fast. I read a comment from Jeffrey Frankel, I think it was, in Project Syndicate, that he says in the end we end up in consolidations that will be really painful the longer we wait. And we should try to find growth enhancing policies. And the question, of course, is how, but we are in a global economy. Not that I'm an expert on competition policy, but I think if we enhance competition at home, companies also learn to compete well abroad. And that makes us be able to sell goods abroad so that we can buy the stuff that we like from the other countries. In Germany, we always talk of the German growth model, which is basically car industry. That's now gone, so we have to find new growth models. And I think the German lower debt is deceptive, as it shares its monetary policy with the euro area. So that there the debt is much, much higher, and also higher than the UK. So let me maybe conclude with something entertaining that you can take home and still talk about to your grandchildren tomorrow or in 40 years, depending. So my father had a stamp collection, and he has very old stamps. One is from 1903, where a postcard or a letter costs three pennies. And then at a later point, you have to buy a postcard for 10. And interestingly, they show pfennig there, the unit, the cents, that you have, the pennies, if you will. And what happened in between is, don't give you the detail about these guys, is the hyperinflation in Germany, right? So inflation picked up in 2023. I think one can see that more or less on this other stamp here. 10 was still pennies. Then they switched to mark to say that it was 30 mark to pay for a postcard. My working hypothesis is this is all postcards. Then soon it was 200 marks, then 50,000, 10 million, and then they basically ran out of ink in colors, so they just printed on a blank stamp the amount, and 2 billion, so Milliard is a German word for billion, is where roughly the hyperinflation ended. So you needed to bring a lot of cash, usually in baskets, to buy your one stamp to send your letter from A to Z. And for some reason, I don't know where my father found this collection. And then came the reform, the central bank reform. And then on the right-hand side, you saw this guy, Heinrich von Stephan. He's the founder of the German Postal Union. And later the Universal Postal Union came out of it, which is now headed by the United Nations. That was in 1924. Somehow 50 years have passed since something. Okay, thanks a lot. Here I listed some papers that I referred to, and I heard there was big competition in Windsor today, but I also have the feeling that there's great dinners for German guests, so I'm looking forward. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Michael. We do have some time for questions. I'm going to try and take them in batches to try and speed things up. I have Bernard, then yourself, then yourself.
I was listening at length to what we're talking about as inflation not being the way and credibility of it. I was thinking about the growth side. There's been much discussion about the credibility of supposedly growth-inducing public investment. This also comes back to the story about German railways or German bridges or a number of other things which you and I have had to worry about in recent times. But the credibility of investments being a growth promoting is something which has been discussed here, particularly in the context of the Office of Budget Responsibility's way of scoring or not scoring proposals which the government has made. Can you say a bit more about how credible growth has to be relative to the credibility of inflation being a one-off? Is growth going to be, does growth have to be something similar to that?
Yeah, okay.
Do you, incidentally, do you know how Germany's going to replace all those niche workers? Do you have any gossip on that?
Niche workers? So, okay, so credibility, niche workers, and...
Well, Dr. Krause, I'd like to thank you very much for your talk. It was ever so clearly delivered. I admire people who can deliver so eloquently in a language other than their mother tongue.
Thanks.
I wish my so-called German were even 1% as good as your English.
You talked to me earlier, I think it's at least 3%.
I think one of the things that a number of members of the audience might not be aware of, and you and I were discussing it before you gave your lecture, is that I spent some time in Germany. One of the things that struck me, and you seem to agree with me, one of the things that struck me is that ministers at the federal level, that's the national level in Germany, either had qualifications in or very practical experience closely associated with the work of the ministries for which they were responsible. Now, that seems to be quite different here. To the best of my memory, the last hooker finance minister that we had in Britain was Dr. Hugh Dalton during the first 2 years of Clement Attlee's government from 1945 to 1947. And the last pucker health minister was a doctor. He had fame, in fact, I'm showing my age, I'm 87. During the war in 1960s, was Dr. Charles Hill, who attained fame with the radio doctor and then became minister in the government in 1960. And I think that shows a very stark contrast, and it makes me very, very pessimistic about the future, in fact, of the UK. In fact, I'd like to ask Dr. Krause, does he think that the British economy will be part of the third world economies in 15 years or less?
Okay, so we have 3 interesting questions there. Niche workers, will the UK become a third world economy? And I've forgotten those, but I'm sure you remember it. Just want to point out, our current Chancellor is an economist, but whether that's necessarily a good thing or not, I'll leave to you to work out. Over to you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, let me start with the credibility. So normally we say, when we think of a credible central banking or credible monetary policy, clearly stated goals, clearly communicated reasonings, and economic forecasts, and what if scenario, what would we do if this happens, and a mixture of things that tries to be as predictable as possible. And it's something that central banks have in their hands, right? They cannot they cannot influence the shocks they face, but they can influence what they do and how they talk about what they do. And I think the last 30, 40 years or so, central banks have been very good at communicating. Now, growth is not something we just do, right? Growth is something that comes out of, in my view, out of a decentralized economy where people with ideas and money they borrow or resources they have realize, try out, and maybe out of 10 ideas, 3 ideas are good and they are successful and they make the economy grow. We cannot And I think governments, also connecting to your talk, governments are not the experts in picking the winners and anticipating the ideas that have not yet been made. I mean, we have to leave that to, ambitious, greedy, well-meaning, all kinds of motivations, but people who try out. And if we let them, and if we give them an environment where that can be realized, of course, not exploiting others and the like, I think we get the best we can. Ideas will pop up. I mean, China is also, now is it the electric vehicle market? These companies are fighting to their death to become the best, and there may be only a few survivors. But it is a decentralized strategy, letting them do that. I mean, who knows whether the government at some point will jump in, but what I want to allude to is that we have to, they are really a believer in the market when it comes to the time dimension. To develop improvements, we have to let them act. And I think the credibility that you mentioned is one where we create a credible environment. The rules of the game don't change every 2 years. And planning one investment means that you can rely on reaping the returns on that investment and not failing because ideas failed. Sorry, okay, then I was thinking about, because the question is where the growth comes from. Of course, public infrastructure, to the extent that it facilitates economic interaction and facilitates the activities of those people that I was mentioning, has to be there. And I have the feeling in Germany, our airports, the fees at the airports are so high that many airlines close connections within Germany. So some businesses are complaining we cannot have our business talks anymore because we don't get our business partners to our factories anymore. If they take the train, it takes them a week, let's say. And so I do agree, if it's public infrastructure and public investment, yes, it has to be credible. You have to develop, build up and maintain infrastructure. And I think also Germany has been a little bit negligent in the last 20 years. And now we have to catch up, and that makes investment much harder. Yeah, so I agree. So this type of investment has to be credible, and we have to be credible in maintaining it and always being up to date in the services the government delivers. With the workforce, so you're speaking of these super specialized workers in firms that so many companies are closing down. So there are 2 levels of replacement. You need the ownership has to be successors for the ownership, and that's very hard. And with a lot of regulation you have nowadays, I think if you didn't grow into the regulation, learning it from scratch is probably a big deterrent for activity. And workers have other priorities because many of these factories are somewhere in the countryside in the southwest of Germany and in other regions. There are many areas where there's these companies, we call them Mittelstand, these medium-sized companies are blooming and were very powerful and deliver their things into the world, but they have difficulty attracting the workers who have the patience to develop into these experts that their predecessors were. And I think we are, at least the headlines you see sometimes is that many companies are going into insolvency or closing down or selling off what they have because they don't find successors for ownership and they don't find successors for the expertise that they were strong at. Or they leave the country. That also happens. And now to the expertise of the government, I always thought if they're only economists, it's like philosophers' rule, right? If they're only economists in the government, they made it there because they're politicians. And in the end, I heard stories from the ministries where the minister even said, yes, I understand your argument. It makes perfect sense. You're right. But I do this because my voters don't care. It's a bit of a caricature, but I think it's an uphill struggle. We have to keep struggling to hopefully offer ideas that sound plausible and that are good. I mean, we also don't know always what's good, but it's a dilemma. I think it's a dilemma between the political. Some countries have technocrats for a while. Draghi, right, was, if you will, in Italy, but it's really hard.
Very difficult one. I have questions from David and Oliver and yourself at the back. Yeah.
Great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Fully agree with your conclusion on inflation. I mean, in the UK, we have a lot of index-linked gilts as well, which kind of heightens the issue. I wanted to ask about the simulation you showed us. Which, it looked very interesting. The thing that surprised me was the inflation response, which you highlighted. Can you give us like a little bit of a flavor of the intuition for what might be driving that? I mean, I'm assuming this is the bond market reaction, which is favoring a more credible transition, but why does it show up in inflation?
Okay, it's a very good question. You want to wait or? So yeah, the shock, I was a bit fast. So the shock, think of a government that has so there's one more thing that I haven't shown you, which is if you will, a taxation rule, or let's say a description of the systematic adjustment of taxes or spending to bring debt always back to some target level. If you had an institutional framework like the EU, where there's a 60% target for debt to GDP ratios and 3%, not more than 3% deficits, if I remember right, then that would be an equation that whenever the debt is above 60%, you would raise the tax rate sufficiently strong so that over time the debt is brought back to the level. One could show that in one more equation. Now, here the experiment is one where the government, for one reason or another, chooses to increase its spending only once and only in one period. So it's a very stylized experiment. We could make everything more persistent with describing different processes for this shock. Could be whatever reason. And then the question is, once debt has shot up once, so on the middle graph, you see the minus 0.8 at the bottom. That is the increase in spending once the debt goes up. That you see on the left. I mean, it's a percentage difference from the steady state of the debt. So this 0.012 is not the 0.8 here, but it's a small fraction of the total debt, but it's a big deviations from a balanced budget. So in log terms and in percentage terms. And so I guess the middle part and the left part is reasonably clear or reasonably understandable. I don't know if it's clear. I understand what I'm saying, so that's all I'm saying. And the right-hand side is this, I mean, it's this fiscal theory of the price level logic where you ask, okay, you have an amount of outstanding debt, and if you make a calculation of whether the debt whether the surpluses that the government generates has a present value that is covering all the debt that is outstanding, right? So on the left-hand side of your equation, you have the debt relative to the price level. And on the right-hand side, you have the present value of all future surpluses, so basically profits, if you will. If there were a company, that would be the value of the company and the present value of its dividends. But here, the dividends of the government is the surplus from taxation and spending. And what the fiscal theory says is if agents have, so you're the holder of the debt. So there's, in the simplest model, they're all the same, and there's a holder of the debt, and you see that the government will be taxing you less than what your debt is worth, then you feel richer. You have a wealth effect. And in the very simple logic, one can make it complicated, you would use that wealth to spend more. And that drives up prices. And that drives up prices until you reach, until there's an equality again of the debt you hold and the value of the future paybacks by the government. So what happens here, the inflation goes up because even though the government is fully committed to pay back all the debt, so all the debt is funded in the sense that there will be future surpluses later on, agents have a doubt whether part of it is unfunded, and then this price reaction takes place, even though there is no reason to, but since there's not full credibility of the government, there's this jump in the price level. There was a long summary of the fiscal.
Because I was going to ask a question actually about the ECB. So can you just talk to, if to the extent you think that fiscal inflation might be possible in the euro, can you tell us what would be the mechanism? Because ECB is obviously pretty independent, so just interested in like how it would actually work.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
I was really intrigued by the slides, the graphs that you showed depicting the short-term, long-term spread.
Mhm.
And I mean, I've been following Robert Brooks and X for quite some time now, and has been blowing the bugle on sort of the duration risk, the increase in duration risk premium being imposed on these sort of long-term bonds. I just wonder if he has sort of taken into consideration that at sort of a certain limit, at like a threshold level, central banks do step in and conduct massive open market operations in order to sort of bring down the sort of yield or the interest rates on these bonds.
Yeah.
So, like, are his projections perhaps a bit too pessimistic?
Mm.
Vielen Dank für den Vortrag. Thank you for the presentation. I had a question less related to the debt sustainability topic, but more on the German economy. And when it comes to the shrinking labor force, how do you view the impact of that on inflation? Because on the one hand, you have a shrinking labor force that could push up wage pressures and therefore cause inflation pressures through that channel. But at the same time, you showed that you also have weaker potential growth, and with weaker activity, that potentially puts downward pressure on inflation. And how do you balance those two? How do you think that balances on and with the effect on inflation? Thank you.
Okay, good question. Maybe because very good, an intriguing question. Of course, so as long as it's a question about potential, and the workers are leaving a productive potential into retirement. So the potential is a capital stock and everything that is there. So it's really hard to say what happens to inflation, because the question is how will output react, because it's all about the output gap, right? If potential falls fast, but maybe because of wealth that we are spending, the demand stays high, then we will have inflation. And firms will scramble to find workers to be hired, and that will push up wages. But if this all happens alongside a slump, if we just move with the shrinking potential, then demand and supply forces will be balanced. But I actually have no good way to justify prediction either way. So, but thanks, it's a good question. I think this is what we need, fully fleshed out models, and then we can play through the factors, rigidities here and there that accelerate it in one way or another, but I have no good answer. Thanks. Your question with this graph, right, whether it's too pessimistic. Okay, this is not, so there are two steps, right? So this is just taken from financial market data. So this is what the markets do. And I think what he worries about is if this signals market skepticism about the value of the debt they are supposed to hold for many years. So they demand, or they only are willing to buy them with corresponding risk premia. And now if the central banks were to step in, which they have in the past, I mean, not very often, but since the last 5 or 10 years or so, then maybe that would affect it, but the possibility of that must be priced in already by, I mean, the thing is, once you have a situation where there's a run on debt, because the governments are not, or the central bank is not credible, then obviously it will not be able to offset this anymore. So I think the risk that so I would maybe argue off my head that exactly the risk that the central banks will not be able to rein in the debt crisis makes these yields go up. That would be my interpretation in favor of this, or in support of the interpretation that Robin Brooks did. And yeah, finally, can you ask a question again? Yeah, so yeah, it's an independent central bank, and the members of the board of the ECB are independent and not supposed to listen to government advice. So I'm not saying that this is my opinion, but some people say that interests of the individual countries are not ignored. Let's say so. In the deliberations in the governing board, potentially pressure could build up to not raise interest rates as fast as one should if it were a totally neutral policy. I mean, was it COVID? The ECB was accused of being a bit slow, saying, yeah, our projections say in half a year inflation is back down to 2% and everything is fine. And actually, I had the chance to ask a question in one of these sessions, and I was saying, but what about all these second round effects? The workers, wage negotiations, pushing up wages, and then leading to a persistent phase of higher inflation because they aim to restore their real wages. The answer was, yes, our models don't say that. And I think because they didn't have these second round effects in the model. I mean, that's a matter of opinion. And I think it's extremely difficult. But I think the way this comes, the fiscal dominance or a more permissive monetary policy comes through just waiting a little longer. Could also have to do with knowing that maybe one country, Italy, would suffer, its budget would suffer a lot if the interest rate rose already. So let's wait a little bit until inflation has unexpectedly deflated away. So I'm speculating. I'm not saying that this is what happened, but I think it works through. Okay, so two things. That's maybe the last thing that I should say now. Are we already? So 1 more minute or 1.5 minutes. So that could be just the circumstances force a very serious governing board to not raise interest rates too fast because they may trigger problems in a country and they rather. So that's a very benevolent way of or not unrealistic, but that this could be one reason. You know it would cause trouble, so you just wait with your interest rate increase. And the other could be, well, you're opportunistic. Maybe you have an interest of some country in mind, and you wait with you argue for a later interest rate increase because you know that will reduce some pressure on the country's budget. I think these are the two. Yeah. Not metaphorical, what I say, impressionistic description of what could happen. What could happen, but definitely hasn't happened.
Okay, I've chaired this really appallingly badly, but we still have one more thing to do, which is a little presentation. So.
I haven't seen this, but I understand it. We have met.
Oh,
which you thoroughly deserve.
No.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks. May I look at it?
You guys. I will get back to this.
Oh, that is a wonderful match.
Can I just have a photo with it?
Open?
There are a lot of information, didn't you, in 70 minutes?
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I'd just like to thank our speaker again. I would like to thank all of you for coming along on such a horrible evening. And your reward is that we do have some wine next door. So please go help yourself.
I feel rewarded. Thank you very much.